DNR river ecologist Mike Davis has been studying freshwater mussels for 35 years. The native species that once covered Minnesota lakes and riverbeds was almost wiped out in the early 1900s by pearl hunters and button makers. On a chilly April day, Mike and his crew are out with a bucket of young muckets that they will reintroduce to a Cannon River tributary.
We are on the Straight River in Medford, Minnesota at the city park, a place I visited for the first time in 1987, doing a mussel survey of the Cannon River system. And the cool thing I found here were a bunch of old shells of a mussel species that no longer lives here. So the mucket mussel had at one time been abundant in the river, here and on downstream, but it was gone. The only place I found live ones was downstream of Northfield and upstream of the dam at Billsby. And so that gave me the idea, way back then, that we could get mussels from that part of the river and bring them back to the areas in the river where they have disappeared. And they filter water like crazy, removing all kinds of contaminants. And then one of their most favorite foods is this bacteria, E. coli bacteria, for which many of our rivers are now listed as contaminated with.
For mussels to grow, each species must have a host fish that carries larvae until it transforms into a juvenile.
The fish that would normally bring them in can't swim here because of the dams that are on the river in various places. And so that brings us to where we are today, a historic time, because we are now using female mussels from that part of the Cannon River, raising the babies in a lab and then rearing them to a good size at the Waterville Fish Hatchery. And today we're going to release some of those here into the Straight River and restart the population that disappeared perhaps 100 years ago or more. We've tagged them and measured them, and we're ready to now release them here into the Straight River, where they hope they will quickly burrow themselves into the bottom and set up their lives and grow up and reproduce and spread up and down the river and make everybody happy, especially me. Free the mussels! They've been stuck in that nasty little basket for 2 years. The muckets.
That's right.
Mucket babies. Goodbye. Look at it. Woo! The muckets are back! The muckets are back! Part of their disappearance had to do with exploitation by the settlers that came in. Somebody discovered a pearl, so everybody ran to the river and started butchering our clams or mussels, looking for pearls, which were extremely rare, of course. And then a guy from Germany figured out that you could make buttons from the shells that were very beautiful and durable. And so they started buying shells, and then people went back to the river and harvested for that. So they depleted the populations to the point where it wasn't worth looking for them anymore, which means they weren't completely eliminated, but their populations were very much subdued. Interesting thing about the harvest was that the guy that invented or discovered you could make nice buttons out of the shells ended up being swindled out of his fortune. He ended up poor, and while bathing in a river as a homeless man, cut his foot on a mussel shell, got infected and died from it. So the mussels got him back in the end. Revenge. Who knows if it's really true, but it's a great story. Never ruin a good story with the actual truth. But then at about the same time, everybody threw everything in the river in those days, including the flush toilets. When they were invented, the pipes went straight to rivers. And it polluted the water so badly that some species actually were wiped out completely. It's like the triple whammy, you know, you got the harvest, the pollution, and the dams all combining, I guess, to get rid of the mussels in the river. And we're trying to undo as much of that as we can.
For mussels to grow, each species must have a host fish that carries larvae until it transforms into a juvenile.
Well, St. Croix is our reference stream for the whole upper Midwest because it still retains the species we think historically were here. About 40 species in the St. Croix River. There are several species that we come get here that you can't find anywhere else. And we're reintroducing the snuffbox into the urban river of Minneapolis, St. Paul in the Mississippi. So it's really cool. It's the winged maple leaf that we come and get here. And we've been releasing them into the Mississippi, and Fish and Wildlife Service has reintroduced them to the Chippewa River in Wisconsin. So to propagate these mussels for reintroduction, you first have to know the host fish.
So we determine what the host fishes are by going out and getting female mussels that we're working on and taking the larvae that they're brooding. They'll brood little clam-shaped larvae in their gills, and so we can bring those back to the lab and either extract them by just flushing them out with a syringe filled with water, or in sometimes some species we allow them to release on their own. We have a variety of fish species in our lab that we use to test and see whether they're compatible with the mussel larva.
This is a hatchery-raised eel. He has now become one of our pets. His name is Bob. Another unique fish that we have in the lab is actually a sturgeon. And then the stars of the show. For snuffbox, we utilize log perch. It is a sole host fish. Snuffbox mussel is the mussel that are also referred to as darter trappers. They open up their shell just slightly and lure, and as a log perch is foraging for food, their head can get clamped by this mussel.
That's one of the cool things about mussels, that, deception is the way a lot of the females go about their business. There's an extension on the back end of the pocketbook female. She'll position into the substrate and expand this lure that looks remarkably like a small fish. And then she'll even push the brooding gills out in between this lure and flap the fish to give it life, trying to entice a bass or a walleye to come and strike the lure. And then the gills are ruptured and fish will suck in the liberated larva, and that's how it happens. Other species, will fool a fish by releasing small little packages of larvae that look like fish food.
Once host fish are inoculated with larvae, they are kept in a recirculating tank system that Madeline designed. When the pinhead-sized juveniles drop off their host fish, they're collected in nets, rinsed through sieves, counted by volume, and grown in containers with recirculating river water.
So we take these containers of mussels out every 3 to 4 weeks. We'll assess the mussels for size and condition and clean the system and then put them back in.
Native mussels at a certain point will start to develop byssus. Byssus will help a juvenile mussel hold on to, a rock or some hard object that will help hold them in place until they're able to continue their growth and develop. So in culture, they become just this beautiful matted mess of juveniles. In nature though, you wouldn't necessarily find them clumped together like this, but because we're holding a container with up to 1,600 mussels in it, we get this nice concoction.
And then we have to separate them all.
Yeah,
the fun part.
And then we get our little fingers going.
The baby mucket mussels are spread out in rearing ponds, including the DNR's Waterville Fish Hatchery.
They spend a year and a half, 2 years out there before we get them back out and they're ready for tagging and releasing.
In the Cannon River system so far, we've released over 1,800 mucket mussels as juveniles at 3 different sites. And as the fish pick up the larvae from where we're reintroducing at these sites, they can swim up and down the river for miles, and then doing that, they'll seed the river with more and more mussels again. And hopefully the population will explode into this, what it probably once was. A lot of our rivers were literally paved with these mussel beds.
If we were to come back in 5 or in 10 years and see smaller juveniles or smaller mussels that are unmarked, those could be a representation that there was a successful reproduction effort and that they're reproducing naturally, which is our end goal.
Funding for this program was provided by the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. Live wide open. The more people know about West Central Minnesota, the more reasons they have to live here. More at livewideopen.com. Western Minnesota Prairie Waters, where peace, relaxation, and opportunities await.